Hello, and welcome to Witness Aid UK. Today I'm going to talk to you about faith and belief when you leave the Watchtower. I have a message for two groups of people who are leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. The first group of people will be those who still believe in God and still have a desire to worship, and who think they are Christians. And the second group of people are those Jehovah's Witnesses who are agnostics and atheists as a result of the influence of the Watchtower upon them. How can that be so? Well, some people who leave the Watchtower are so disillusioned by religion after their experience in the Watchtower that they give up on religion altogether. And they throw the baby out with the bathwater because they give up on God also. And some of them become atheists because their trust has been destroyed by the lies and deceit of the Watchtower Society. That is something for which they are very reprehensible. It sometimes disturbs me when I meet former witnesses, because those who still have a faith seem to still have Jehovah's Witnesses in their mentality. They haven't shaken it off. And it's a bit like walking around with gonorrhea or syphilis, which hasn't been treated. And it is that serious, believe me. Because you have to remember that for many years when we attended meetings, we were receiving regular contaminations of Watchtower false doctrine. It's as if it was injected into our brains, and it left us with the mental disease of the Watchtower. And some people carry that around with them for the rest of their lives. Those who desire to worship can't go into a church because they've been told that the churches of Christendom are evil, run by Satan, and all the doctrines are false, and that they never read the Bible. And that's why many Jehovah's Witnesses who desire to continue worshipping, they have nowhere to go. So they're hanging on to this half-baked, pseudo-Christian Jehovah's teaching that's scrambled up in their head because they've never really been able to work out what the truth of the Bible is. And that all comes down to the fact that they don't know how to think for themselves, and they don't have the ability to trust people outside to teach them the doctrines of Christianity. It's enough that the Watchtower told them that everything outside is false. Well, I'm going to show you who want to be religious, and you others who are not so sure, a method that you can use to replace the rotten pit props in the Watchtower mind, and to replace them with something solid and beneficial to you, something that will improve your life and give you a belief system that you can depend upon and rely upon for the rest of your life. Now, knocking out pit props in a mine is rather a dodgy thing to do, because you might have a cave-in and you'll be obliterated. So it's going to take a leap of faith to knock out the first few pit props. The method I'm going to tell you about is not something of my own invention. It comes from one of the greatest philosophers of the Western world. So if we go back 400 years to France, we find Rene Descartes sitting in his room, thinking. And he's trying to work out a method, rather like a mathematical method, which will be a sound and safe, accurate way of gaining knowledge about the world around us. Now he's troubled because he's not sure if most of the things that he's ever been told by other people are accurate or not. And living in a religious time, he's not too sure if there might be some malicious little demon standing on his shoulder, whispering in his ear and trying to deceive him. The first problem that Descartes recognizes is his senses. He realizes that he cannot trust his senses because they may deceive him. And he gives a simple example of a stick in water. When we see a stick in water, it appears to be bent, but we know it's really straight. However, our senses tell us that it is bent. So we can't always rely on our senses. Then he gives an example of dreams. We may think we are sitting by a warm fire, talking to a friend, but in fact, we are dreaming, and we wake up lying in bed. So again, we can't be absolutely certain that everything we think about is reliable. What seems to be the case is not always the case. So, by asking himself many questions about the basic and fundamental things that he believed, he was able to come to some conclusions. And finally, he came up with his famous dictum: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And with this eureka moment, he realized that he existed because he is a thinking being. And then he went on to build bricks on top of that most fundamental fact. And he went on to prove the existence of God. That was the very next thing he did, in fact. So this method is a very reliable and useful way of working out truth. I can take you back to the time when I left the Watchtower, and I went through the same process that Descartes recommends in his method. Having realized that some of the things the Watchtower taught were false, I decided that I couldn't trust anything else that it had taught me. So I discarded everything. I knocked out all the pit props in one single day, walking around Edinburgh's botanical gardens again and again and again, thinking and thinking. And I began to ask myself fundamental questions. Is there a God? If so, what is it? Does he have a name? Is it a person? where do we come from? What are our origins? Is this holy book, the Bible, something I should believe? Is it something I can rely upon? And so on. Now, those were pretty profound questions to think about in just one day. But I came to a few conclusions, and as a result of my thinking, I began to read the Bible. And for the first time in my life, I finished reading it in just a few weeks. And I went on then after that to read the New Testament another 8 or 9 times. I read different translations. I read the Revised Standard Version, the New International, the New English, the Good News, the Amplified Version, the King James Version, the Kingdom Interlinear Literal Greek Translation in English, and 2 or 3 others. So I really knew the New Testament by the time I had finished, and I had a broad reading and understanding of the Old Testament. Now, having done that, a Christian friend held my hand and took me to church a few times. And I must say, I felt very strange going into a church because of all the things I've been told about by the Watchtower. But I found that things were very different. First of all, they read the Bible in church. And not only do they read the Bible, but they explain it and discuss it. And may I say that some of the sermons I have heard in church are more profound than anything I have ever heard in a Kingdom Hall. I have had new perspectives on scriptures I have read dozens of times. Another nice thing, a beautiful thing, is to hear women preaching and praying. Isn't it a shame that Jehovah's Witnesses, and some other churches too, deny women the opportunity of preaching and praying for the congregation? They're losing half of their talent by doing that. And again, some of the best sermons I've ever heard have been given by women. So gradually I went along, and then I visited a few churches. I went to an Alpha course. I was reading the Bible at the same time, and I became a Christian. It just kind of crept up on me. But although I had some initial doubts and nervousness, I could never have done that if I had still had the full import of the mental disease of the Watchtower in my head, because I would never have been able to walk into a church in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a super duper Christian today. I think I'm still just hanging on, you might say. Because I question my faith. I don't just blindly accept it. I don't regard myself as a churchgoer. In fact, I don't often go to church because of my working hours. I work at weekends. But the funny thing is, compared with Jehovah's Witness meetings, is that when I have a day off, I go to church because I want to. Also, during the week, I sometimes attend short half-hour services at lunchtime, which is just a Bible reading, a prayer and communion. So I can keep in touch with church if I wish. I'm now going to recommend some books to you, particularly for those of you who don't want to read the Bible anymore. They're mostly books on philosophy and thinking, but they would benefit everyone. Before I do that, I just want to remind you about my blog, which is called witnessaid.blogspot.com. And in the blog, you'll find a series of articles discussing the core teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's the ones that you used to teach to people when you were having a so-called Bible study with them. And it would be helpful for you to review them as you leave the Watchtower, because it will just confirm for you the falsehoods that the Watchtower actually taught us for so many years. The first book is called In the Beginning, A New Interpretation of Genesis. It's written by Karen Armstrong, whom I have recommended before in my video about books to read when you leave the Watchtower. It's just what it says. It's an examination of the book of Genesis, and it discusses the myths therein. Now, if you're shocked by that expression, let me say that a myth is not false. A myth is full of truth. It's just not something that actually happened, but it is nevertheless true. It is an explanation of our origins. It comes from folklore, perhaps, but it is nevertheless a profound and essential insight into where we came from. Therefore, we can learn a lot from the book of Genesis, even though it may not be factually true. Another book by Karen Armstrong is called The Bible the Biography. And again, this is looking into the writing of the Bible, where it was written, and when, and more importantly, who wrote it. You will be surprised when you find what she has to say. Now, for those of you who are leaving Jehovah's Witnesses, who are disillusioned with religion, I have some words to say. And I ask you, what are you going to believe if you discard all of the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses? I certainly would recommend that you discard all those teachings, because they're worthless. However, what are you going to believe instead? Because I'm sure that if you were attracted to religion in the first place, you probably have the desire to lead a good life, a purposeful life, a life with meaning. Well, it may comfort you to know that for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, philosophers have been writing about those very things. And if you look at the writings of Aristotle, Plato and Socrates, their major concern was the question, what is the good life? What is a moral life? Now, if you haven't read philosophy before, and you're uncertain whether you would appreciate or understand philosophy, don't be afraid. Because if you are able to think and come to some conclusions on your own, then you are a philosopher. Maybe a very primitive one, but nevertheless, you are doing what philosophers do. So start off with a simple book, such as An Introduction to Philosophy. There are lots of them about, quite inexpensive, and you'll get them in the library too. And they will give you a few chapters on the basic points of philosophy. Subjects like the philosophy of religion, ethics, metaphysics, logic, and other things. You might also try these. This one is called What Philosophers Think, and it's edited by Julian Baggini. That's Baggini. Here's another one. It's called Great Thinkers A to Z. And again, it's a discussion not so much of philosophical ideas, but of philosophers themselves and the ideas that they had. And Rene Descartes is in this book also, as well as the greats such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. Another series I would recommend you to look at is the Penguin Great Ideas series, and this one is Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. It's basically the observations of humanity by a Roman emperor and general. Finally, if you want something that's not quite philosophy but not quite religion, have a look at this book. I've been reading it recently. That's right, it's called The Teaching of Buddha. Perhaps you know that Buddhism is not actually a religion, it's a philosophy, and it just gives a few simple precepts for life. If you would like a very short introduction to Buddhism, you can download a free book on Kindle. It's called The Essence of Buddhism, and it's by David Tuffney. That's Tuffney. And that is available free of charge on Kindle. And it basically just sets out the core concepts of Buddhism. And in fact, reading that alone would give you some good ideas for living your life. Indeed, it's a great shame that some of the rich American Christian preachers don't read that book, because it's full of good ideas about avoiding materialism and leading a simple life. Whether you are religious or not, you may be finding difficulty expressing opinions and thinking for yourself if you were one of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's perfectly normal, and I'll tell you why. When I was a child, there were a number of major medical advances. In the 60s, there was the introduction of the contraceptive pill. Not long after that, there was abortion on demand. Then there was in vitro fertilization, test tube babies, and also there was the first heart transplant. Now, when Jehovah's Witnesses found out about these things, they didn't say, I'll have to go and have one of those heart transplants myself because I've got a bad heart. No. They would always say, I wonder what the society's viewpoint is on that. And some of them would go off and look up Watchtower volumes in the library, trying to find answers in questions from readers on the Watchtower's opinion of these things. So not only were we not taught to think as Jehovah's Witnesses, it was actually actively discouraged. So it may take a while for you to develop your thinking faculties, but your opinions are valuable too, believe me. I've already said that the philosophers can give you a meaningful, purposeful, moral and ethical way of life if you follow what they have to say. And it's not a question of just blindly opening a book and reading something and then doing it. But you take from the book or from the writer what you understand, and then you apply it to yourself. So in conclusion, the most important thing you can do on leaving the Watchtower is to cleanse yourself of its contaminating influence so that you can move forward in your life. Having purified your mind by purging it of Watchtower lies, you then want to put other things back in. But be selective. Use Descartes' method. Discard everything, and then one by one take a few gems of knowledge and information and make them your own. And never stop learning. Don't just walk into a church on a Sunday morning and become a Christian the day after you were believing Watchtower propaganda, which was diametrically opposed to what the Christian church teaches. And even if you become a Christian, have an open mind. Read other things. Read philosophy. Read the teachings of Buddha. Read books which criticize what you believe and challenge you. Don't just swallow everything that you're told. Don't look for ways of confirming your own biases. Whatever happens, I can tell you this: you're in for an exciting journey, because now your mind is free. Now you can decide for yourself what kind of life you're going to have, and you can decide whether it's going to be a good life or a moral life, an ethical life, or a controlled life. It all depends on you now. So I hope you find your way, and thanks for listening.